In 1854, with the passing of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, tens of thousands of pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers from all over the United States rushed to the territory to decide if Kansas would become a free or slave state. When these settlers arrived, they immediately found themselves in conflict. This conflict led to many years of violence, murder, election fraud, and assault. At the core of this dispute is the Kansas-Nebraska Act because it calls for popular sovereignty among the people of the newly formed Kansas. Popular sovereignty is a commonly favored principle among the people because it allows them to ultimately control their government. However, in the case of Kansas, popular sovereignty brought about more harm than good. The event was largely viewed as a foreshadow to the Civil War because of its involvement in rising tensions between pro- and anti-slavery people. All of this together makes us ask the question, how did Bleeding Kansas influence the Civil War?
It all started with a man named Stephen Douglas. He's a Northern Democrat and a senator from Illinois. He wants to see a proposal go through Congress that would allow for a railroad to go through his state out into the western frontier. And this railroad route would encourage settlement. But before this could happen, the Kansas and Nebraska territory is unsettled, and it needs to be settled, and it needs to be turned into states. These railroads impacted the formation of Kansas and the controversy that would follow. Now, the problem for Stephen Douglas is that Southerners have no reason to support this plan because in 1820 they decided that slavery would not be allowed to pass north of the 3630 line of the Missouri Compromise. As you can see in this picture, the 3630 line provided a fine line between what state can have slavery and what state can't. So, he's going to organize the unsettled territories north of the 3630 line into two territories, Kansas and Nebraska. And the issue of slavery would be left up to the people in those territories. The people of the settlers would vote whether to allow slavery or not. And the Southerners really liked this plan. Suddenly, now we have an opportunity to see slavery go somewhere where it was previously banned. This bill is called the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the reaction in Congress regarding the Kansas-Nebraska Act is immediate, and the Northerners opposed. The idea of popular sovereignty caused a major increase in tensions between the North and the South. In the Missouri Compromise, we close this area off to slavery, and suddenly, now under this Kansas-Nebraska Act, Southern slave owners have an opportunity to expand slavery into an area where it was previously banned, and there's a huge reaction to the Kansas-Nebraska Act within the people. There's a huge debate in Congress, and the people who agree with the Kansas-Nebraska Act are Southern Whigs and many Democrats in the South. Those who oppose are Northern conscious Whigs, Free Soil Northerners, and Free Soil Democrats all voted against it. But it passes anyway and creates a huge increase in sectionalism, and it leads to the death of the Whig Party. The Whig Party falls apart after the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They are deeply divided between one and another, and a new political party forms, the Republican Party, and it is nothing more than an opposition party when it first starts out, and they're opposed to this act. The whole goal at the beginning of the Republican Party was to stop the spread of slavery in the territories. It is comprised of Northern Whigs, Free Soilers, former Liberty Party abolitionists, and some anti-slavery Whigs and Democrats. We feel that the significance of the Republican Party is represented in how it greatly influenced the start of the Civil War. The formation of this party even further divided the North and the South, because the two sides were not willing to compromise after the fall of the Whig Party. The intense arguing in Congress and the violence that was starting in Kansas was only going to get worse because of the Republican Party's formation. So, you see the Republican Party form. But what happens after the Kansas-Nebraska Act is that pro and anti-slavery people flood into Kansas. You have the sack of Lawrence in 1856, where a free soil town is attacked by pro-slavery forces. You have John Brown and his forces hacking to death pro-slavery people at Potawatomi Creek. And by 1856, Kansas is bleeding. It is bleeding Kansas. It is a civil war between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. And the Kansas-Nebraska Act will lead to the events in bleeding Kansas, and it will lead to the growth of the Republican Party and an increase in sectionalism to further divide the nation. We feel the violence that was produced in the events of bleeding Kansas has considerably influenced the start of the Civil War. It caused people from all over to get involved in the question of slavery and develop intense viewpoints. The violence ultimately just worsened the relationships that had existed between people with different viewpoints.
Overall, the combination of popular sovereignty, the formation of the Republican Party, and the violence that occurred in Kansas all created a point of no return for influencing the start of the Civil War. We were surprised by what we found, especially how big of a role popular sovereignty has in influencing how people behave and how a simple event can change a country.